Welcome to Molly's Playground, a pole dancer's perspective on mindset, identity, and taking up space. This is a podcast for the people who are done shrinking themselves. Here we break free from expectations, perfectionism, fear, and all of the things that keeps us small. True movement, honest conversations, rebellious reflections, and the world of pole dance. We explore what it really means to stand strong in yourself, trust your own voice, and take up space unapologetically. So fuck the norm, fuck who you're supposed to be, and fuck the idea that you need permission to exist fully. I'm your host, certified life coach, international pole dance educator, and professional oversharer, Molly Pretzel. Let's fucking go. Hi love. Today I want to talk to you about something that has completely changed the way I understand both healing and myself. It's something I see over and over again in my coaching sessions. It's something I've noticed in people I love, and it's something I have had to work through myself. Because for a really long time, I believed that one of the hardest things I had ever been through wasn't just something that had happened to me. I believed it was who I was. When my mom left me when I was 6 years old, it didn't just hurt. Somewhere along the way, my brain quietly turned that experience into a conclusion about me. That conclusion was, people will leave me. I'm not someone who people will choose. If I want people to stay, I have to work harder. I have to be more. I have to earn my place. And the scary part is I didn't even realize I was living from these beliefs. They became so familiar that they just feel like reality. Looking back now, I can see that so many of those decisions I made, the relationships I built, and even the anxiety I felt around other people weren't actually coming from the present. They were coming from a 6-year-old version of me trying to make sense of something that never should have happened in the first place. And that's what I want to explore with you today, because I think so many of us mistake the story or pain taught us for our identity. We start believing that because something happened to us, it must say something about who we are. What if your trauma is part of your story without having to become your identity? That's what we are diving into today. And I think this might be one of the most important conversations we have had on this podcast so far. One of the biggest lies we accidentally tell ourselves after we have been hurt is that all trauma has to become our identity, not because we choose it consciously, but because our brain is constantly trying to make sense of what happened. Basically, it goes like this: something painful happens, and instead of storing it as something happened to me, our brain quietly changes it into, this says something about who I am. Maybe you were rejected and your brain concluded, I am hard to love. Maybe someone abandoned you and your brain concluded, people always leave. Maybe you were criticized growing up and now you believe, I'll never be enough. Notice what happened. The event became a belief. The belief became a lens, and eventually the lens became your identity. The problem isn't that you experienced something painful. The problem is that you have spent years collecting evidence that the story your pain created must be true. Because that's what our brains do. They don't look for what's true, they look for what's familiar. So if somewhere deep inside you believe nobody wants me, your brain will notice every unanswered text, every awkward conversation, every cancelled plan, every teeny piece of evidence that confirms that story. Meanwhile, it quietly ignores all of the moments that didn't fit. Not because you're broken, not because your trauma ruined you, but because your brain is incredibly good at protecting the identity it already believes is true. And maybe that's the question I want you to sit with today. What if the thing that's keeping you stuck isn't your trauma anymore? What if it is the story your trauma taught you to believe about yourself? Because those are two very different things, and only one of them you have the actual power to change. One of the reasons I want to make this episode is because I think this shows up in so many more places than we realize. And no, I'm not just talking about people who would describe themselves as traumatized. I'm talking about all of us. Because maybe this isn't showing up as a big, obvious trauma in your life. Maybe it's showing up as feeling like you always have to prove yourself at work. Maybe it shows up in dating because you're constantly waiting for the other person to lose interest. Maybe it shows up every time someone gives you feedback and your first instinct is to think you have failed. Or maybe you're the person who can't relax, the person who always has to be productive, the person who always takes responsibility for everyone else. We often think those are just personality traits. That's just who I am. But have you ever stopped and wondered, is this actually who you are? Or is it just who you have learned to become because of something you have experienced? Because that is two different things. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is assuming that because a pattern has been with us for years, it must be part of our personality. But sometimes it's simply a survival strategy that has been running for so long that we have forgotten why it started. And survival strategies are incredible. They protect us. They help us get through difficult situations. The problem is, they are often designed for a version of our life that no longer exists. So we keep using old strategies to solve new problems. Not because we are broken, not because we are doing anything wrong, but because our brain is trying to keep us safe using the information it has learned through years and many years ago. And that's why I think this conversation matters so fucking much. Because if you don't understand the story your past taught you about yourself, there's a good chance you'll spend your future defending a version of yourself that was only ever created to survive. Before we dive further in, I just want to ask you for a tiny favor. If at any point during this episode someone pops up into your mind, a friend, a sibling, a partner, someone you love, someone who keeps saying things like, I'm just broken, this is just who I am, I'll never get over what happened, would you please send them this episode? Not because I want more downloads, but because I really do believe so many of us are carrying stories about ourselves that were never actually ours to carry. Sometimes all it takes is hearing one sentence, one different perspective for something to finally click. And if this conversation can give someone a little more hope or a little bit more compassion for themselves, then I think that's worth sharing. And who knows, maybe the person who needs this conversation the most is actually you. So let's get into it. Have you ever caught yourself saying, that's just who I am? Maybe you're the person who always apologizes, the person who overthinks every text message before hitting send, the one who keeps people at arm's length because it somehow feels safer not to get too close. Maybe you struggle to accept compliments because they don't feel true. Maybe you work twice as hard as everyone else because deep down you feel like you have to earn your place. Or maybe you're constantly trying to make everyone around you happy while quietly ignoring your own needs. And because you've done it for so long, it doesn't even feel like a pattern anymore. It just feels like you. I think that's one of the hardest parts, because when something has been part of your life for years, it starts feeling like your personality instead of a strategy. You stop asking where it came from and you stop questioning whether it's actually serving you. You just assume this is who I am. And here's what I find so fascinating. Most of us don't realize that we are not reacting to what's happening right now. We are reacting to what our brain expects is going to happen. If somewhere along the way your brain learned that people leave, you will probably start looking for signs that they're about to leave you again. If your brain learned that love has to be earned, you will probably keep trying to prove your worth in every relationship. If your brain learned that making mistakes isn't safe, you will probably become a perfectionist without even understanding why. Not because you are irrational, not because you are broken, but because your brain is trying to protect you from experiencing that same pain again. The problem is, those protective strategies don't just protect us from getting hurt. They also protect us from being fully seen, from trusting, from resting, from receiving love, from believing people when they tell us we are enough. And after a while, we stop seeing those behaviors as protection and we start calling them our personality. And I think that's where so many of us get stuck because it's incredibly difficult to change something when you believe it's who you are rather than something you have learned to do. This is probably where my perspective is a little different because I don't actually think the biggest problem is the trauma itself. I think the biggest problem is the meaning we attach to it. And please do not misunderstand me here. I'm not saying your experience weren't painful. I'm not saying they didn't shape you. I'm definitely not saying you should just move on. I think we need to do the almost opposite. We need to look at it, feel it, understand it, give ourselves permission to grieve it. Because healing isn't pretending like nothing happened. But I also don't think healing is spending the rest of your life introducing yourself through your pain. For years, I believed that because my mom left when I was 6, it meant there was something fundamentally wrong with me. I didn't realize it at that time, but somewhere in my little 6-year-old brain, I had translated one event into one belief. If my own mom didn't stay, maybe I'm just not someone people choose. That wasn't a fact, it was a conclusion. But here's the thing, our brain are incredible at protecting the conclusions they have already believed. So without even realizing it, I spent years looking for proof that people would leave me. If someone became distant, I noticed. If someone canceled plans, I noticed. If I felt rejected, even just a little bit. It confirmed everything I already believed about myself. And because I believed I wasn't enough, I worked so freaking hard to become enough. I became the person who overgave of everything, the person who was overperforming, the person who tried to earn love instead of simply receiving it. Looking back now, I can see that I wasn't just carrying the pain from when I was 6. I was recreating it again and again and again and again. Not because I wanted to suffer, but because my brain thought it was protecting me. That's why I don't think healing is about erasing your past. I think it's about becoming curious enough to ask yourself, what story did this experience teach me about who I am? Because that's where the real work begins, not in changing what happened, but in questioning whether the conclusion you drew about yourself were ever true in the first place. I believe that's one of the kinds of things we can do for ourselves. Not to deny our past, but to stop allowing it to write every chapter that comes after it. Your trauma may explain part of your story, but it doesn't get to decide who you are, nor who you want to become. Now, if you're listening to this and think, okay, Molly, I get it, maybe I have been carrying around a story that isn't actually true anymore, so why is it so fucking hard to change? First of all, don't swear. Oh, just kidding. I think that's exactly the right question. Because if changing your belief was as simple as deciding to think differently, none of us would still struggle with them. The reason this feels so difficult isn't because you're weak. It isn't because you're unwilling to heal. And it definitely isn't because you're broken. It's because your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's braining, my friend. Our brain loves certainty. They love patterns. They love familiarity. Not because familiarity is always healthy, but because familiarity feels predictable. And predictable feels safe, even when it hurts. Think about it. If you have spent 20 years believing people leave, Your brain has spent 20 years collecting evidence for that belief. It's built highways around it. It's become automatic. So when someone tells you, actually, maybe that's not true, your brain doesn't celebrate that. It panics. Because from your brain's perspective, you're not changing a thought. You're changing your map of the world. You're asking it to stop relying on something that's helped you survive for years. And survival strategies don't disappear just because we realize we don't need them anymore. They need to get replaced gently and repeatedly with something that feels just as believable. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons so many people give up on healing too early. They expect change to feel natural, when actually it often feels unfamiliar at first. And unfamiliar can feel incredibly uncomfortable, not because you're moving in the wrong direction, but because you're moving in a new one. So before we talk about how we begin changing those beliefs, I think we first need to understand what our brain was trying to protect us from in the first place. Because once you understand that, you will probably stop judging yourself so much for why you've been holding on. I think one of the kindest things we can do for ourselves is stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking what was my brain trying to protect me from. Because I generally don't believe our brains are trying to sabotage us. I think they're trying to help us survive. Think about a little kid for a second. A 6-year-old doesn't have the life experience to say, my parent probably left because they were struggling with their own pain. Kids don't think like that. Children makes everything personal. If someone leaves, it must be because of me. If someone is angry, it must be because I've done something wrong. If love feels inconsistent, maybe I have to earn it. Not because those conclusions are true, but because they help the world make sense. And that makes complete sense. Our brain hate unanswered questions. So when something painful happens, they fill in the blanks. They create stories, not because it's accurate, but because having a story feels safer than having no explanation at all. The problem is our brain rarely come back years later and update the story. The 6-year-old version of us makes a conclusion, and the 30-year-old version of us keeps living it as though it's true. That's why so many of our patterns feel so automatic. They're not just They're not just conscious choices anymore. They're predictions. Your brain is constantly asking, based on everything we have experienced before, what do we think is about to happen? And then it prepares you for exactly that. Not because it knows the future, but because predicting danger has always been one of the most important jobs your brain have had. So if you have experienced rejection, your brain predicts rejection. If you have experienced abandonment, your brain predicts abandonment. If you have experienced criticism, your brain predicts criticism. And here's what's really fascinating. Your brain would rather be right than surprised, because being surprised by pain once was enough. So now it tries to spot it before it even happens. The problem is when your brain spends years expecting something, it also becomes incredibly good at noticing anything that confirms those expectations. That's why two people can have experiences that are exactly the same situation and walk away with completely different conclusions. One person thinks they didn't reply because they're busy. Another one thinks they didn't reply because they don't like me anymore. Same event, different story. And that's why I don't think our lives are shaped only by what happened to us. I think they're shaped by the meaning we learn to attach to what happened. And here's the part I hope gives you a little bit of relief. None of this means you're broken. It doesn't mean you're dramatic. It doesn't mean you're overreacting. It means you have a beautiful human brain doing exactly what human brains have evolved to do, trying to keep you safe, even if the strategy it's using is no longer one you need. So now you might be thinking, okay, I understand where this comes from. I understand why my brain learned it. So why do we still keep doing it? Because understanding something and changing something are two completely different things. Insight is the beginning, yes, but not the finish line. I think that's something we don't talk about enough. We live in a world that loves breakthroughs. One podcast, one book, one therapy session, one conversation. And suddenly everything is supposed to change. But that's not usually how people work. Your patterns weren't built in one day. They were repeated over and over and over again every time you apologized before speaking, every time you ignored your own needs, every time you stayed quiet to avoid conflict, every time you overworked to prove your worth. Your brain wasn't just having a thought, it was rehearsing an identity. And identities are incredibly difficult to let go of, not because they're true, but because they're familiar. And then there's another layer that I think is just as important, the people around us. Because whether we realize it or not, our environment teaches us who we are expected to be. Maybe you have always been the responsible one, the peacemaker, the strong one, the independent one, the funny one, the one who never asks for help. After years of hearing those labels, you don't just believe them, you start to organize your life around them. And the strange thing is, the people around us often get comfortable with the version of us they have always known. So when we begin changing, it can feel uncomfortable for them too. Not because they don't love us, but because changing disrupts the relationship they have become familiar with. Sometimes they will unintentionally encourage us back to old patterns, saying things like, you have changed, you're overthinking it, you're so sensitive now, you used to be so easygoing. And suddenly the old version of you feels easier. Not because it was healthier, but because everyone knew how to relate to that person. So healing isn't just learning new beliefs. Sometimes it's learning how to disappoint people's expectations of who you have always been. And I do believe that's one of the bravest things we can do, because choosing a healthier version of ourselves often means feeling misunderstood before you feel understood. It means tolerating the discomfort of becoming someone new, while your brain still wants to pull you back towards the familiar. And that's hard. It's really fucking hard. Not because you're failing, but because growth almost always asks us to leave behind something that once kept us safe, even if that something is simply the story we have been telling ourselves for years. So after hearing all of this, you might be wondering, does this mean I will always have these thoughts? Love, I don't think that's such an important question. Because if our brains are built to recognize familiar patterns, doesn't that mean we're stuck with them forever? I actually don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because I have experienced what happened when those old stories slowly begin to loosen their grip. Not overnight, not at once, but little by little. The thought might still show up, but it stops being the only voice in the room. It stops feeling like the truth, and it starts feeling like an old opinion. One that doesn't get to make every decision anymore. I still have moments where my brain offers me the same story it did years ago. Maybe you're too much, maybe they will leave, maybe you need to prove yourself. The difference is, I don't actually believe it anymore. And that changes so many things. Because here's something I think we often misunderstand. Healing isn't reaching a point where your brain never offers you old beliefs again. Healing is reaching a point where those beliefs stop running your life, where you notice them without handing them the steering wheel, and you can imagine what a life would look like then. Imagine walking into relationships without constantly waiting for them to end. Imagine receiving a compliment and allowing yourself to believe it. Imagine making a mistake without questioning your worth. Imagine saying no without carrying guilt for the next 3 days. Imagine resting, without feeling like you have to earn it first. The circumstances of your life might not look dramatically different, but your experience of living them would. Because when the story changes, the way you move through the world changes too. You stop spending all of your energy trying to protect yourself from the past that isn't happening anymore. And instead, you get to start responding to the life that's actually in front of you. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of healing. Not that it changes who you are, but that it gives you the freedom to discover who you were before fear convinced you otherwise. So how do we actually begin to change this? I don't think it starts by trying to force yourself to think positive. I don't think it starts by pretending the old thoughts aren't there. And I definitely don't think it starts by shaming yourself every time they come back. Because remember, your brain isn't doing anything wrong. It's simply repeating what it has learned. So instead of asking, how do I stop having those thoughts? I think a much kinder question is, what if I stop treating every thought as the truth? That one shift changes so much for me, because for years I wasn't just experiencing thoughts, I was obeying them. If my brain whispered, "You're too much," I immediately made myself smaller. If it whispered, "People will leave," I started preparing for them to leave. I never stopped to ask whether those thoughts were actually describing reality or simply repeating an old survival strategy. And I believe that's where change begins, not by winning an argument with your brain, but by becoming curious about it. Instead of saying, "This is who I am," try asking, "Where did I learn this?" Instead of saying, "This always happens," try asking, "Is that actually true? Or is that what my brain expects to happen?" Those questions sound simple, but they create space, and space is really fucking powerful. Because the moment we create a little bit of distance between ourselves and our thoughts, we also create the possibility of making a different choice. And the thing that really helped me was realizing that I didn't need to prove my old beliefs wrong overnight. I just needed to become willing to collect different evidence. For years, my brain was like a detective. Its entire job was to prove that people would eventually leave me. And you know what? When that's the case, you will always find something. Someone replies a little later than usual. Someone seems distracted. Someone forgets to invite you somewhere. And suddenly your brain goes, "See, I fucking told you so." But what I hadn't realized was that my brain had completely ignored all of the evidence pointing in the opposite direction. The people who stayed, the people who cared, the people who choose me over and over and over again. I simply wasn't collecting that evidence. So I started questioning myself a different question. If I wanted to prove that people do want me in their life, what evidence already exists? At first, it felt a bit fake, because my brain had spent decades rehearsing one story. Of course, a new one didn't feel natural. But over time, it became easier, not because I forced myself to believe something unrealistic, but because I finally allowed myself to see parts of reality I'd been filtering out. And I think that's something worth remembering. Healing isn't replacing one lie with another. It's allowing yourself to see a fuller picture. The old beliefs usually come from one painful chapter, but they convince us they're describing the entire book. When we begin questioning them, we don't erase the chapter, we simply stop letting it narrate every page that follows. That's why I think curiosity is one of the most healing qualities we can develop. Curiosity asks questions that shame never will. Curiosity makes room for new evidence. Curiosity makes room for growth. And maybe that's all healing really is, not becoming someone else, but becoming willing to see yourself through eyes that aren't still trapped in yesterday. So maybe you're sitting there thinking, I can actually recognize myself in this. Maybe you've even realized that some of the things you called personality have really just been old survival strategies. In that case, I don't want you to leave this episode with just another new perspective. I want you to leave with somewhere to begin. Because understanding yourself is powerful, but understanding only changes your life when it starts influencing the choices you make afterwards. And the beautiful thing is, those choices don't have to be dramatic. You don't have to wake up tomorrow as a completely different person. You don't have to suddenly stop feeling insecure or never question yourself again. I don't think that's how healing works. I think healing is built in incredibly ordinary moments. The moment where your brain offers you the old story and for just a second, you pause before believing it. Maybe that's the first victory. Not that the thought disappeared, but that you noticed it. Because once you notice it, you finally have a choice. And every time you choose curiosity over certainty, every time you question an old belief instead of automatically obeying it, you're teaching your brain something new. Not through force, but through repetition. So before we finish today, I want to leave you with one small exercise. Nothing complicated, I promise. Just something you can try the next time your brain tells you a story about who you are. Because sometimes one small question asked at the right moment can begin changing a story that has been running your life for years. The next time you notice yourself feeling triggered, maybe someone doesn't reply to your message, maybe you make a mistake, maybe someone gives you feedback, maybe you feel rejected. Instead of asking, why do I feel like this? Try asking yourself, what story am I telling myself right now? Not what happened, but what meaning did I attach to what happened? Because those are two completely different things. Maybe the event was, they replied 6 hours later, but the story became, they're losing interest. Maybe the event was, my boss corrected my work, but the story became, I'm not good enough. Maybe the event was, someone cancelled plans, but the story became, people always leave. Start there, just notice it. You don't have to change it immediately. You don't even have to argue with it. Simply become aware of the story, because awareness is the first place where freedom begins. And once you have noticed the story, I want you to ask yourself one more question. If someone I loved believed this about themselves, would I automatically assume it was true? I love that question, by the way, because something interesting happens when we stop looking at our thoughts from the inside and start looking at them from the outside. Most of us are incredibly compassionate with other people. If your best friend said, I am unlovable because someone left me, you probably wouldn't say, yeah, that sounds accurate, right? You would remind them that one person's behavior doesn't define their worth. So why do we speak so differently about ourselves? I think that's one of the reasons this exercise matters. It interrupts the automatic certainty we have been carrying for years, not by replacing it with blind positivity, but by introducing curiosity. And curiosity changes everything because certainty says, this is who I am. Curiosity asks, could there be another explanation? And I believe that's where healing begins. Not when all of your old beliefs disappear, but when they stop being the only explanation you're willing to consider. Every time you ask yourself those questions, you're creating a tiny pause, a tiny crack in the story. And through that crack, new experiences get a chance to enter, new evidence get a chance to enter, a new understanding of yourself get a chance to enter. This is why this isn't just a mindset exercise, it's a practice in teaching your brain that the world might be bigger than the story it has learned years ago. And the beautiful thing is, you don't have to believe a completely new story today. You only have to become willing to question the old one. And when you are ready, I want you to start collecting evidence. Not evidence that your old story is true. Your brain has been collecting that for years. Start collecting evidence that challenges it. If your story is nobody chooses me, write down every single moment someone did. A friend checking in, someone inviting you out, someone hugging you really close, someone staying. At first, your brain will probably tell you those moments didn't count. Keep writing them down anyway, because you're not trying to lie to yourself. You're teaching your brain to notice part of reality it has been filtering out. Before we finish, I want to prepare you for something, because I think this is where a lot of people accidentally convince themselves that healing isn't working. You will probably try this, and your brain will immediately argue back. You will ask yourself, what story am I telling myself? And your brain will respond, no, this isn't a story, this is reality. Or you will start collecting evidence that challenges the old beliefs. And your brain will say, yeah, but that doesn't count. I know mine did. When I started looking for evidence that people actually wanted me in their life, my brain had an answer for everything. They're just being polite. They probably feel sorry for you. They don't really know the real you. It was almost as if my brain was trying to defend the old story, and in a way it was. Because remember, your brain has spent years believing that story kept you safe. Of course, it isn't going to let go after just one journal entry or one podcast episode. That doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're human. One of the biggest mistakes we can make is believing that healing should feel convincing from the very beginning. I actually think the opposite is true. At first, the old story usually feels far more believable than the new one. Not because it's more accurate, but because it's more rehearsed. You've been practicing it for years, maybe decades. The new perspective haven't had the opportunity yet. And that's why I think thought work matters so much. Not because we're trying to force ourselves to think positively, but because thoughts become habits, and habits become the lenses through which we experience our lives. If we never question those lenses, we will keep interpreting new experiences through old conclusions. We'll keep proving yesterday right, even when today is trying to show us something different. That's why I don't see thought work as positive thinking. I see it as updating an old map. A map that may once have helped you survive, but no longer describes the territory you're actually living in. And updating that map takes repetition, not perfection. Some days you'll believe the old story again. Some days you will react exactly the way you always have. That doesn't erase your progress. It simply gives you another opportunity to notice it, to pause, to ask a different question, to choose a slightly different response. Because healing isn't built in the moments where everything feels easy. It's built in the moments where your brain offers you the old story. And you gently remind yourself, thank you so very much, sir brain, for trying to protect me. But I don't have to let you decide who I am anymore. And maybe that's the mindset I hope you leave this episode with. Not, I need to stop having those thoughts, but I don't have to build my identity around them. So if there's one thing I hope you take away from today's conversation, it is this. You are not the worst thing that has ever happened to you. You are not the belief your pain created. And you're not the survival strategies your brain developed to protect you. Those things may explain why you struggled. They may explain why a certain situation feels like so difficult. They may explain why you keep falling into the same pattern, but they don't get to decide who you are. I hope today's episode reminded you that there's nothing wrong with you. There's a reason you think the way you do. There's a reason you act the way you do. And once you understand those reasons, you no longer have to keep confusing them with your identity. Healing isn't about pretending your past never happened. It's about refusing to let your past become the only thing that gets to tell you who you are. Because the stories we tell ourselves shape the lives we'll create. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to start telling yourself a different one. Your past deserves to be understood. It doesn't deserve to become your identity. Your brain doesn't become your present because it remembers your past. It becomes your present when it mistakes your past for your identity. Your brain is constantly trying to answer one question: who the fuck am I? And the answer it gives aren't always based on truth. They're often based on repetition. If you have spent years telling yourself, I'm too much, your brain starts treating that like a fact. If you have spent years telling yourself people always leave, your brain starts expecting abandonment before it happened. If you spent years telling yourself, I'm not good enough, your brain would quietly look for evidence that confirms it. Not because those things are true, but because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. That's why healing isn't about getting rid of painful thoughts. It's about remembering that those thoughts don't get to decide your identity. Your thoughts are experiences. Your identity is a choice. And every time you pause before automatically believing an old story, you're deciding which one gets to shape your future. I think that's one of the most powerful things we can realize as human beings. The voice in your head isn't always your identity. Sometimes it's just your history talking. And history deserves to be understood. It doesn't deserve to decide who you become. Your pain may have written your first chapter. It doesn't get to write the rest of your story. So before we finish, I just want to leave you with one final thought. Maybe you've spent years trying to become someone different, more confident, more worthy, less anxious, less afraid, more lovable. But what if healing was never about becoming someone else? What if it's about slowly uncovering the person who has been there all along? Underneath all of the fear, underneath all of the survival strategies, underneath all of the stories your brain had to create to make sense of your past. Because I don't think healing creates your identity. I think healing removes everything that convinced you that you weren't enough to begin with. And I know that takes time. Some days you will believe the old story again. Some days you will catch yourself shrinking or apologizing or assuming the worst. That's okay. Progress isn't measured by how rarely your brain tells the old story. It's measured by how quickly you remembered that it doesn't have to be the truth. Every single time you choose curiosity over certainty, you take one small step back towards yourself. And eventually, those small steps become a completely different life. So if you only remember one sentence from today's episode, I hope it is this. Your past explains you. It doesn't define you. Or maybe this one as well. You're not who your pain convinced you that you had to become. Because I believe that's where healing is. Not forgetting your past, not pretending it didn't hurt, but refusing to let your pain have the final word about who you are. And if today's conversation made you think of someone who spent years believing they were broken, someone who's convinced they will never change, or maybe someone who's quietly carrying a story about themselves that was never theirs to carry, I would love for you to share this episode with them. Because sometimes hearing one different sentence at exactly the right moment can become the beginning of an entire different story. And if that story starts today, I am really fucking grateful we got to spend this time together. So my love, thank you for listening. Until next time, keep playing. Love, thank you for hanging out with me on Molly's Playground. If this episode spoke to you, share it on your social media and come say hi over at Instagram on Molly Pretzel. And who knows, maybe one day we'll take up space together in real life too. Until then, take your space, trust your voice, and keep playing. See you on the playground next week.